The day has done all it needs to do. Now only stillness remains. Let your thoughts loosen, like threads unraveling in the dark. What comes next is not to solve or to chase, just a quiet story drifting close. Perhaps it's a voice that remembers you, or a silence that has waited patiently. Let it meet you where you are, and let it lead you gently into rest. The stained glass saints had watched over St. Hilarion's chapel for 3 centuries, their jewel-toned eyes witnessing every whispered confession and candle-lit prayer. But tonight, their fractured light painted strange patterns across the stone floor, shapes that moved just slightly out of rhythm with the flickering votives. Emma traced her fingers along the cold pew where she'd found her grandmother's rosary hours earlier, the beads still warm from some unseen hand. The caretaker had insisted the chapel was empty when the antique slipped from the choir loft. That same caretaker now stood frozen in the side doorway, his lantern casting long shadows that didn't quite match his movements. "You'll want to leave before the fog rolls in," he murmured, though the night air hung clear as glass. His left thumb kept rubbing at a smudge on his cufflink, a tarnished silver M that caught the light at odd angles. Outside, something rustled through the dry yew branches, though the wind had died at sunset. Emma pretended not to notice when the oldest stained glass panel, the one depicting Saint Cecilia with her shattered lyre, clouded over as if from human breath. She'd learned young that some questions invited answers best received in daylight. But the chapel's silence had a weight to it now, the kind that settles when too many people stop speaking at once. The caretaker's footsteps echoed too loudly as he retreated down the nave, his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the checkered floor tiles. Emma waited until the heavy oak door groaned shut behind him before exhaling slowly. The air smelled faintly of melted wax and something else, old paper, perhaps, or dried lavender left too long in a drawer. She turned her attention back to the choir loft where the rosary had fallen. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight, each step releasing a whisper of dust into the dim light. Up close, the railing bore the marks of countless hands, its varnish worn smooth in uneven patches. A scrap of sheet music fluttered near the organ bench, the notes faded, but still legible. Emma hummed the melody under her breath, a hymn she didn't recognize, though the arrangement felt hauntingly familiar. The pages trembled as if disturbed by a draft, though the air was perfectly still. Then, from the corner of her eye, she caught movement, a flicker of white near the far window. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. A figure, barely there, standing where the moonlight pooled on the floor. Emma's breath hitched, but she didn't turn. Some instincts ran deeper than fear. Instead, she reached for the abandoned sheet music, her fingers brushing against the paper just as the chapel's lone candle guttered out. Darkness swallowed the room, but the melody lingered soft and distant, like a voice humming just beyond hearing. The candle flame sputtered back to life on its own, casting trembling light over the sheet music now clutched in Emma's hands. The notes seemed to shift slightly, as if the ink had bled just enough to alter the melody. A name was scribbled in the corner, Eleanor, 1898, in handwriting that looped and curled like vines climbing a trellis. Downstairs the pews creaked, though no one sat in them. Emma carefully folded the fragile paper and tucked it into her coat pocket. The air had grown colder, the kind of chill that seeped into bones rather than skin. She descended the choir loft steps slowly, her palms skimming the railing where the wood felt oddly warm in patches, as if recently touched. Near the altar, a single white rose lay across the open pages of a hymnal. It hadn't been there before. The petals were fresh, dewdrops still clinging to them despite the chapel's dry air. Emma reached for it, then hesitated. A whisper of sound, not quite a voice, not quite a sigh, drifted from the confessional booth in the far corner. The curtain swayed, though no one had entered. She took a step toward it, then another, her pulse steady but insistent in her ears. The booth's wooden lattice was carved with lily and thorns, the patterns worn smooth by time. As she neared, the faintest scent of rosewater and candle smoke curled around her. Then, from behind the curtain, a single word so soft it might have been imagined. *remember. The word hung in the air, like incense smoke present, but impossible to grasp. Emma's hand froze inches from the confessional curtain. The rosewater scent deepened, carrying with it a whisper of old parchment and the faintest hint of a perfume that hadn't been made in 100 years. Behind her, the white rose trembled on the hymnal pages before tumbling to the floor, its petals scattered in perfect semicircle, pointing toward the stained glass window of St. Cecilia. Moonlight bled through the colored panes, casting fractured sapphire and crimson across the scattered petals, transforming them into something like a trail. Emma followed it to the window's base, where the stone sill bore shallow scratches. Kneeling, she ran her fingers over the marks, not random, but deliberate. Musical notes. The same melody from the choir loft, carved long ago by someone with patience and something urgent to preserve. A draft stirred the hair at her nape despite the still air. When she turned, the confessional curtain lay perfectly still again, but the white rose petals had rearranged themselves into the shape of a key near the chapel's smallest door, the one that led to the bell tower. Somewhere high above, a single bell chimed, though no rope had moved. The sound was soft, mournful, and utterly impossible. The caretaker had told her the bells hadn't rung since 1913. The bell's echo lingered like a question in the air as Emma approached the tower door. The iron keyhole beneath the carved lintel was crusted with age, but the brass knob turned too easily under her hand. A spiral staircase ascended into shadows, the stone steps worn smooth in their centers from generations of footsteps. The scent of rain-soaked wool and candle wax grew stronger as she climbed. Halfway up, her fingers brushed against something tucked between the stones, a faded ribbon, the color of tarnished silver, tied in a perfect bow. It was still slightly damp. From above came the faintest pressure of movement, like someone leaning against the tower walls just out of sight. The higher Emma climbed, the heavier the air became, not with dust, but with the peculiar thickness that precedes a thunderstorm, though the night outside remained clear. At the final landing, the bell rope hung motionless, its frayed end dangling inches above the floorboards. But the largest bell bore fresh marks in the layer of dust where hands smaller than Emma's had clearly gripped its rim. The year 1912 was engraved along the bronze edge, nearly worn away, but then from somewhere impossibly close, a sigh. Not fearful, not threatening, just present, like someone sharing a secret they'd held too long. The ribbon in Emma's hand fluttered without wind, its loose end pointing back down the stairs, not toward the chapel, but to the overgrown churchyard below. The churchyard lay silvered in moonlight, its crooked headstones leaning like old men sharing secrets. Emma's breath formed pale clouds as she stepped onto the damp grass, the ribbon still coiled around her fingers. It tugged faintly, as if caught in a breeze that didn't touch the surrounding trees. Beneath the largest yew, where the roots knotted into natural benches, sat a child's porcelain doll. Its face was weathered but unbroken, the painted eyes still bright beneath decades of dirt. A scrap of matching ribbon identical to the one from the tower was tied around its waist. As Emma crouched to examine it, the chapel's stained glass windows flared suddenly brighter, casting jewel-toned shadows across the grave markers. The dates told their own story. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, 1899 to 1912. Beloved daughter *. The adjacent stone was newer, but equally weathered. Rev. Charles Whitmore, 1865 to 1913. He kept the faith *. The doll's head tilted slightly, though Emma hadn't touched it. From the chapel behind her, the phantom melody resumed slower now, sorrow tempering its former playfulness. The ribbon in her hand grew warm, then cool again in rapid succession, like a pulse. Somewhere beyond the churchyard wall, a nightingale began to sing. The doll's glass eyes reflected the moon in perfect twin crescents as the first real breeze of the evening stirred the grass between the graves. The nightingale's song wove through the churchyard, threading the silence with notes too precise to be entirely natural. Emma turned the doll over gently in her hands, revealing initials carved into its wooden base, the letters worn smooth by time and touch. A rustle came from the yew tree's branches above. Not wind, not an animal. The sound of fabric brushing against bark. Emma looked up just as a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness. A girl's silhouette perched on the lowest bough, her outline shimmering like heat over candle flame. She couldn't have been older than 12. Her dress was the color of fog, its hem frayed, but still holding the ghost of careful embroidery. She swung her legs gently, as if sitting on a pier rather than a tree limb, and though her mouth didn't move, the nightingale's song shifted, gaining words, half remembered and half dreamed. Lay me down where the willows weep. The doll in Emma's hands grew heavier. The ribbon around its waist loosened, then slithered free, floating upward to wrap itself around the girl's wrist. She smiled then, not at Emma, but at something or someone just beyond the oldest headstone. The scent of rain intensified, though the sky remained clear. A single drop landed on the doll's porcelain cheek, tracing a path like a tear before vanishing into the cracks of time. The nightingale's song dissolved into the dark as the girl's silhouette faded like ink in water. Only the ribbon remained, drifting down to catch on Emma's sleeve before settling in the grass. She reached for it, but the moment her fingers brushed the fabric, the churchyard tilted just slightly, as if the ground itself had taken a breath. The dates on Eleanor's headstone shimmered, the numbers blurring before resolving into different digits. 1899 to 1913. Then back again. 1899 to 19. The doll trembled in Emma's grip, its painted eyes reflecting not moonlight now, but the warm glow of kerosene lamps. For a heartbeat, the churchyard was no longer overgrown, the grass trimmed, The headstones clean, the air thick with the scent of lilacs and damp earth after spring rain. A woman's gloved hand brushed Eleanor's grave, leaving behind a single white rose before vanishing like a snuffed candle. The vision broke. Emma found herself kneeling, the doll cradled against her chest, its porcelain cool once more. The ribbon had tangled around her wrist of its own accord. The ends knotted in an intricate pattern that resembled a musical clef. From the chapel's bell tower, a single note rang out clearer this time, purposeful. Not the mournful tone from before, but something brighter. An invitation. The doll's head turned slightly toward the sound, its glass eyes catching the stars. The bell's clear note still hummed in the air as Emma stood, the doll tucked carefully in the crook of her arm. The ribbon around her wrist pulsed warmly again, tugging her toward the chapel with the insistence of a child's hand. As she stepped through the arched doorway, the interior had changed. The dust was gone. Candles burned in every wrought iron sconce, their light dancing across freshly polished pews. The scent of beeswax and hymn books replaced the earlier mustiness, and the stained glass saints seemed to breathe color into the room with renewed vibrance. At the piano near the choir loft, a woman in a high-collared dress played the melody from the sheet music, the same one carved into the windowsill. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, though no sound came from the instrument. When she turned her head slightly, Emma saw the same delicate features as the doll, aged by grief but still recognizable. Eleanor, no longer a shadow in a tree, but solid, real, stood beside the piano, one small hand resting on the woman's shoulder. The ribbon around Emma's wrist loosened, floating across the chapel to wrap itself around Eleanor's fingers. The vision held for one perfect, suspended moment. Then the candles guttered out one by one, leaving only moonlight and the lingering impression of music. The doll in Emma's arms was warm now, its porcelain face tilted toward the piano as if waiting for the next chord. Somewhere in the dark, a page turned. The sound of the turning page lingered like a sigh in the darkened chapel. Emma moved toward the piano, her footsteps muffled by an unseen carpet that hadn't been there moments before. The sheet music on the stand was blank now, the staff lines empty as if waiting for a composition yet to come. She set the doll gently on the piano bench. Its porcelain fingers curled slightly against the wood, as if remembering the weight of real hands on ivory keys. When she touched the fallboard to close it, the engraved nameplate caught the moonlight. For Eleanor, 19, the air shifted behind her, not a presence, but the memory of one. Emma turned to find the shadows near the confessional rearranging themselves into the suggestion of a man's silhouette. Tall, broad-shouldered, the glint of a watch chain across a waistcoat. Reverend Whitmore, perhaps, or some other guardian of this story. The doll's head tilted toward the figure, its glass eyes reflecting nothing and everything at once. A current passed through the chapel, not a wind, but the sensation of someone stepping back, of making space. Then, from the choir loft, a single clear note rang out, not from the bell this time, but a young voice testing its range. The stained glass trembled in its leaded frames, casting sapphire and ruby shards of light across the doll's serene face. Emma exhaled slowly. The ribbon had vanished from her wrist, but its impression remained, a faint warmth against her skin, like the afterglow of held hands. The choir loft's single sustained note dissolved into silence, leaving behind only the faintest vibration in the air, the kind felt in the ribs rather than heard. Emma climbed the steps again, each one creaking a different pitch, as if the wood remembered every hymn ever practiced here. At the top, the abandoned sheet music had reappeared on the organ bench, but the notes had changed. The melody remained recognizable, though now accompanied by a second, intertwining harmony, a musical conversation between two voices. In the margin, new words had been added in the same looping script. Asterisk, when threads unravel, tie them with light. Asterisk. Outside, the first true breeze of the evening stirred the yew branches, their shadows dancing across the chapel's interior like skeletal fingers playing some invisible instrument. The doll still sat primly on the piano bench below, but its posture had shifted. It now faced the altar, its painted eyes fixed on the rose window where dawn's first light would eventually appear. Emma turned the sheet music over. On the reverse side, a child's drawing, a house with smoke curling from its chimney, a garden with flowers taller than the people tending them. Stick-figure parents held hands with a smaller figure between them, all three smiling beneath a yellow sun. The paper trembled in her grip as the chapel's temperature dropped suddenly. Her breath clouded before her, and in that brief mist, she glimpsed the faintest reflection, not her own face, but a young girl's mouthing words that left no sound. The doll's head turned toward the stairs with an audible click of porcelain. We're building toward revelations about Eleanor's fate while maintaining the story's dreamlike atmosphere. The supernatural elements remain poignant rather than frightening, with the doll serving as a bridge between past and present. The click echoed through the silent chapel like the turning of a key in a long unused lock. Emma descended the stairs slowly, the sheet music clutched against her chest. The doll had toppled sideways on the piano bench, its glass eyes now fixed on the confessional booth, where the curtain swayed, though no one had entered. A new scent mingled with the beeswax and aged paper freshly, turned earth and the faint metallic tang of a coming storm. The stained glass saints watched with their jewel-toned eyes as Emma approached the confessional, her shadow stretching unnaturally long in the candlelight. She reached for the curtain just as the first raindrops pattered against the chapel's roof, a sudden downpour drumming against centuries-old slate. The sound should have drowned out all else, yet Eleanor's voice came through clear as crystal. Asterisk, he didn't mean to leave me. The words hung in the air, weightier than the rain, heavier than the silence that followed. The doll's arm lifted slightly, its porcelain finger pointing toward the altar where a Bible lay open to Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The pages flipped on their own, settling on a pressed flower, a white rose, identical to the one that had appeared earlier. Its petals were translucent with age, veins visible like a map of forgotten roads. Outside, lightning flashed. In that brief illumination, the shadow of a man knelt beside Eleanor's grave, his head bowed as rain streamed down his face like tears. The storm's violence faded as quickly as it had begun, leaving the chapel steeped in the hush that follows thunder. The shadowy figure at Eleanor's grave was gone, but the Bible remained open, its pressed rose trembling slightly, as if stirred by breath. Emma lifted the fragile bloom, its petals disintegrating slightly at her touch. Beneath it, hidden in the gutter of the book's spine, was a folded slip of paper, a letter, the ink faded but still legible. My dearest Eleanor, Forgive me for not being there when you took ill. The railroad delay seems no excuse now, though I raced home the moment I received the telegram. Mrs. Henderson says you asked for me at the end. Know that I would have given every sermon, every hymn, every stained glass window in this chapel, just to hold your hand one last time. Asterisk, the choir will sing your favorite hymn tomorrow. I've tuned the bells to ring in D major, as you always preferred. Asterisk. Yours in sorrow and hope, Papa. The doll had righted itself on the piano bench, its head now tilted toward the bell tower stairs. The ribbon Eleanor's ribbon lay coiled at its feet, the silver threads catching the candlelight like liquid metal. From the choir loft, the opening notes of Abide With Me drifted down, played on an organ that no longer existed. The melody swelled, filling the chapel with a resonance that vibrated in Emma's teeth, in her bones music not heard, but felt. The stained glass St. Cecilia smiled sadly, her lyre missing a single string. The phantom organ music built to a crescendo that should have shaken the rafters, yet the candle flames burned straight and steady. Emma climbed the bell tower stairs once more, the ribbon now threaded through her fingers like a lifeline. Each step carried the scent of oiled rope and damp stone, the tower's old smells, preserved across a century. At the top, the largest bell gleamed as if freshly polished, its engraved 1912 now accompanied by a second date, 1913, the year Reverend Whitmore had followed his daughter. The ribbon tugged Emma's hand toward the bell's rim. When she pressed her palm against the cool bronze, the metal thrummed with residual music. Her touch left no mark, yet the bell began to swing gently, of its own accord, its deep tone resonating through the chapel below. In the churchyard, visible through the tower's narrow window, two figures stood beside Eleanor's grave, a tall man in a clergyman's coat, and a girl in a white dress. They didn't shimmer or fade like earlier visions, but stood solid as living flesh, the morning's first light passing through them as if they were made of stained glass themselves. The doll appeared beside Emma on the tower floor, its porcelain face upturned to watch the bell's pendulum arc. As the ringing reached its peak, the ribbon in Emma's hand unraveled completely, its threads dispersing like dandelion seeds in a sudden gust. The final note hung in the air, sweet and sorrowful, and somehow complete. Dawn painted the chapel in pastels as Emma descended the tower steps, the doll cradled in the crook of her arm. The interior had returned to its modern state, dust motes floating in sunbeams, the scent of aged wood and wax replacing last night's phantom perfumes. The sheet music lay on the piano once more, but now it was whole, no tattered edges, no faded ink. The completed composition spanned both sides of the page, Eleanor's harmony woven seamlessly with her father's melody. At the bottom, two signatures, Eleanor Whitmore in careful schoolgirl script, and beneath it, Charles Whitmore and a minister's steady hand. Emma set the doll gently on the altar steps where sunlight could warm its porcelain cheeks. As she turned to leave, the chapel doors swung open of their own accord, morning birdsong replacing the last echoes of the bell. Near the churchyard gate, the caretaker waited, his silver M cufflink gleaming. He touched his hat brim in silent acknowledgement, his eyes lingering on the doll, visible through the open doors. When he spoke, his voice held neither surprise nor fear, only quiet understanding. She always did like that hymn. Emma glanced back once. The doll sat precisely where she'd left it, but sunlight now glinted off something new around its neck, a tiny silver pendant in the shape of a musical note. The caretaker smiled, soft as the fading mist. "Some stories don't need endings," he said. "Just someone to listen." The caretaker's words lingered in the morning air as Emma stepped beyond the chapel gates. The doll remained on the altar steps, its porcelain face tilted toward the stained glass, as if listening to a song only it. Yet something had shifted. The air no longer held that peculiar thickness. The silence no longer buzzed with unspoken words. Emma turned to ask the caretaker about the pendant, but he was already walking away, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. His shadow stretched long in the dawn light, merging with the silhouette of the chapel's tallest spire. She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket. The sheet music was still there, but now it felt different, lighter, as if the ink had released some long-held sigh. Unfolding it, she saw that the notes glimmered faintly, like gold leaf catching the sun. A breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of a music box, a delicate, tinkling melody that matched the one. Emma followed the sound down the overgrown path behind the churchyard, where a forgotten garden struggled beneath decades of neglect. At its center stood a marble fountain, dry and cracked, its basin filled with fallen leaves. But as Emma approached, water began to well up from somewhere deep below, clear and bright, spilling over the edges in a quiet rush. The music grew louder, though there was no mechanism, no wind-up key, just the fountain's renewed pulse and the reflection of a girl's smiling face in the water. The fountain's water shimmered with an impossible clarity, each droplet catching the morning sun like scattered prisms. Emma knelt beside it, her fingertips brushing the surface. The reflection staring back wasn't hers. It was Eleanor's, but not as the shadowy figure from before. This version of her was vivid, alive, her cheeks flushed with color, her eyes bright with unspent laughter. Behind her, the garden flickered in and out of focus, sometimes wild and tangled, sometimes meticulously kept, with roses climbing trellises and herbs sprouting in neat rows. A wooden swing, now rotted to splinters, reappeared whole for a heartbeat, swaying gently as if just abandoned. The music box melody wound down, its final note hanging in the air like a question. Then, from the depths of the fountain, a small object floated to the surface, a locket, its gold chain tangled in a waterweed that hadn't been there moments before. Emma lifted it carefully. The locket was warm, as if held in someone's palm for hours. When she pried it open, two faces stared back. A younger Reverend Whitmore, his stern features softened by a rare smile, and Eleanor, her hair in braids, a white rose tucked behind her ear. The fountain's flow slowed, then stilled. The water grew cloudy, then clear again, but now it reflected only Emma's own face, the garden around her firmly rooted in the present. Yet the locket remained, its chain coiled in her palm like a promise. From the chapel behind her, the bell tolled once, a deep, resonant sound that carried no sorrow, only quiet certainty. The locket's clasp was stiff with age, but it opened smoothly when Emma fastened it around her neck. The weight of it against her collarbone felt familiar, as if she'd worn it for years rather than moments. She traced the engraved initials on the back, E.D., identical to those on the doll's base. The fountain had gone still again, its water dark and leaf-strewn, but the garden around her seemed brighter somehow, the colors richer, the air sweeter. Even the weeds looked less tangled, as if they'd remembered how to grow with purpose. A rustling came from the overgrown path ahead. The caretaker stood beneath an arch of ivy, his hands tucked into his pockets. He didn't speak, only nodded toward a break in the foliage where a wrought iron gate, nearly swallowed by vines, marked the entrance to another part of the grounds. Emma pushed through the greenery, the locket bouncing lightly against her chest. The gate groaned open with surprising ease, revealing a cemetery far older than the churchyard. Its headstones leaned like crooked teeth, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of rain. At the very center stood a mausoleum, its marble facade stained with lichen. The door was ajar. From within came the faintest hum of a familiar melody, "Abide with me," but slower, softer, as if sung by someone who'd long since forgotten the words but remembered the feeling. The caretaker's voice carried from behind her, gentle but firm. "Not all stories end where you expect them to." The mausoleum's interior was cooler than the morning air, the scent of damp stone and old roses clinging to the walls. Sunlight filtered through a stained glass window, set high above, a depiction of an angel holding a lyre, its colors muted but still vibrant. The humming stopped as Emma stepped inside. Before her stood 3 sarcophagi, their lids carved with sleeping figures. The center one bore Eleanor's name, the dates 1899 to 1912 etched beneath a bouquet of stone flowers. To its left, Reverend Whitmore's likeness stared heavenward, his hands folded over a Bible. But the third sarcophagus, smaller, placed slightly apart, was unmarked, its surface smooth except for a single word: "Remember." The locket around Emma's neck grew warm. She reached for the unmarked tomb, her fingers tracing the letters. As she did, the dust shifted, revealing a second, fainter inscription beneath: "For the child who listens." A breath of wind stirred the mausoleum, though the door had. The angel's lyre and the stained glass window shimmered, its strings vibrating soundlessly. Then, from somewhere deep in the garden outside, a child's laughter echoed bright and clear and utterly alive. Emma turned toward the sound just as the locket's clasp loosened, falling into her open palm. The chain slithered free like liquid sunlight, coiling itself around the base of Eleanor's sarcophagus before dissolving into the stone. The caretaker appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by morning light. "Come," he said. Asterisk. The living shouldn't linger too long among memories. Asterisk. The garden path back to the chapel felt shorter than before, the trees leaning away to let the sunlight through. The caretaker walked ahead, his steps silent on the mossy stones. Asterisk. You're not really the caretaker, are you? Emma asked. He paused beside a hawthorn tree, its branches heavy with last night's rain. When he turned, his face was younger still, lined with time, but his eyes brighter, his posture straighter. The silver M cufflink at his wrist gleamed. "I tend what needs tending," he said. Asterisk. Some stories grow wild if left untrimmed. Asterisk. A breeze carried petals from the hawthorn, scattering them across the path like snow. Among them, Emma spotted a single white rose, fresh, dewy, identical to the ones that had appeared in the chapel. She bent to pick it up, but it dissolved at her touch, its fragrance lingering just long enough to remind her of Eleanor's ribbon, of the doll's faint rosewater scent. The caretaker, if that's what he was, smiled. "You'll dream of this place," he said. Asterisk. Not as it is, but as it was. as it could be. The chapel bell rang again, though no one had pulled the rope. The sound was different now, lighter, almost playful. Emma turned to look back at the mausoleum, but the garden path had shifted. The iron gate was gone. In its place stood a child's swing, swaying gently in the breeze. The caretaker's voice softened. Asterisk, go home, Emma. They're at rest now. Asterisk, she blinked. She'd never told him her name. The day has done all it needs to do. Now only stillness remains. Let your thoughts loosen, like threads unraveling in the dark. What comes next is not to solve or to chase, just a quiet story drifting close. Perhaps it's a voice that remembers you, or a silence that has waited patiently. Let it meet you where you are, and let it lead you gently into rest. Not all spirits seek to frighten. Some just wish to be remembered. If their tale lingered with you, let it rest with your breath. Sleep well tonight. And if you hear a whisper in your dreams, maybe it's just the end of the story.